Hi, I'm Helena, and I did my project on Renato Rizaldo, and I focused on the evolution of the ethnography, and I included some personal photos. I'm really sorry because they're going to stretch out. I could only find a couple, um, but those are from my trip to Nepal, and so basically that's my background, and my introduction into this topic. So in 2005, I went to Nepal for the first time with my family in the midst of the communist revolution. My father was a climber back in the day and a writer, and he had a lot of experience in the Himalayas, but he had always wanted to go to this little area called Mustang in the northwestern region of Nepal, and it's dubbed a Forbidden Kingdom, and it just opened up to tourists right around that time. And so the first time we went, it took a lot of different transportation to get there. There was three little tiny planes, a tractor ride, and then once we got in, there was just horses. That's the only transportation. There was no cars or motorcycles or really anything like that. And once inside, I mean, it was like going back 500 years in time. Was the culture was preserved, and no outsider influence had gotten in because they'd been so strict about who they let in, which was essentially nobody. So that was pretty free of any Western influence, even Nepali culture. It was really just old Tibetan culture. And that was the beginning. I mean, I was 10 years old, but that was just the beginning of my introduction to informal ethnography and cultural observation. And after that, we went back every summer and I started documenting more and more. And eventually, I created a film about the effects of the construction of a new Nepali road down through the old salt route on a small Buddhist nunnery in Mustang. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was doing crude anthropological work without the guidance of theory or proper training in participant observation or really anything else. But through writing and interviews and creating my documentary, I began picking up on things and recognizing my own bias and the ethnocentricity of my views. When I was conceptualizing my documentary project, I came up with very focused and specific interview questions for my young nun subjects, and they were very negatively posed about the road. In my head, I felt as though their culture was being imposed upon, and it was up to me, an outsider, to make the nuns realize the impacts that the road would have. And before even doing research or educating myself more, I just took a stand for an entire culture against another culture, and I was determined to prove that I was right. And I'm still learning how my perspective was flawed. So, my fourth trip back in 2016 brought a lot of change. And that time around, I immersed myself as I had never done before. Instead of staying in a secluded, separate area and going out just on day trips with my family, I went to live with the nuns and spend every moment I could with them. And so I got to know them a lot better, and more importantly, they got to know me better. And as I discussed the approaching road construction with the other nuns, or sorry, excuse me, with the nuns and locals and experts, my mindset shifted, and I was embarrassed that I had ever thought I would be an agent within this culture. I wasn't there to inform or preach, I was there just to listen and learn as much as I could. And of course, the nuns knew what was going on in their community. I wasn't telling them anything new, and they opened my eyes to the benefits of the road, including the better parts of other culture, not just shunning the bad. And things that I had believed to be bad were television, electricity, and pop culture, but those aren't inherently negative. Some of the benefits there would be quicker access to hospitals, schools, internet, electricity would provide greater connections, there'd be new trade opportunities, and the people of Mustang would continue stewarding their culture and customs. So, moving on to Risaldo, in 1989, he published his ethnography, Grief and a Headhunter's Rage, and his writing was much different than his peers' work. His ethnography was in a different essay format. It was very conversational as opposed to a third person scientific model. The subject of Risaldo's work and his style of writing called into question subjectivity, objectivity, and the science of ethnographies. Using concepts such as thick description and multivocality pioneered by anthropologists Clifford Geertz and Victor Turner, Risaldo navigated postmodern theory and its possibilities. Thick description was particularly important to Risaldo's work. Geertz described the practice of thick description as a way of providing cultural context and meaning that people place on actions, words, and things when doing qualitative research. Thick descriptions provide enough context so that a person outside the culture can make meaning of the behavior. And Risaldo relied on the use of thick description while doing his research among the headhunters of the Ilongot and connected to his own personal experience. So before going into the strides and changes Risaldo brought to ethnographic writing, I will explore his critiques of classic norms and old ethnography. Risaldo provides the example of an epithetical lone ethnographer whose mask of innocence, or as he put it, his detached impartiality, barely concealed his ideological role in perpetuating the colonial control of distant peoples and places. In the same vein, Risaldo discusses the lone ethnographer's assessment of the timeless traditional culture that served as a self-congratulatory reference point against which Western civilization could measure its own progressive historical evolution. In retrospect, using my younger self as kind of a test subject, I was guilty of viewing Mustang's culture in the same way at the beginning of my travels. Risaldo and other postmodern authors view this perspective as the concept of the privileged position. Within social science, privileging a position is to give favor to certain types of beliefs and explanations while discounting others. Risaldo trained himself to work around the biases and privileged positions of the lone ethnographer, but only after he came to understand the Ilongot's headhunting practices through his own grief. Before Risaldo employed a postmodern theory, he had difficulty understanding why the Ilongots headhunted because he was applying a Western scientific model rather than confronting the specific interests of not only his informants, but of his position of anthropologist. In a 2017 interview with Risaldo, he described his adoption of the Ilongot way of mourning called Liget, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but he said he will always struggle with putting the feeling into words, but his best translation of Liget is high voltage. And once Risaldo connected to this emotion, his understanding of the reasons behind headhunting followed, and he could make sense out of chaos. While Risaldo's postmodernist style of ethnography could be criticized for not being scientific enough, he does pose a strong argument that interpretation changes with positioning. Anthropologists in the 1960s were mainly concerned with the methodology of gathering data. In a reaction to the lack of preparation in fieldwork, ethnoscientists and cognitive anthropologists set specific parameters for doing fieldwork and interviews in an attempt to produce valid and replicable results. Postmodernists agree that training in language and ethnography is important, but they don't expect these skills to produce a scientific anthropology. And for postmodernists such as Risaldo, anthropology allows for the opportunity to reflect upon and analyze the culture of our own society as much as it allows for the analysis of the other. And in this way, anthropology became a dialogue between ethnographers and the cultures they intended to study. There are layers to studying culture, and personal experience must be included. Rosaldo wrote, "For years, I thought that more verbal elaboration, which was not forthcoming, or another analytical level, which remained elusive, could better explain older men's motives for headhunting. Only after being repositioned through a devastating loss of my own could I better grasp that Ilongot older men mean precisely what they say when they describe the anger and bereavement as the source of their desire to cut off human heads. Either you understand it or you don't." So, although the debate is ongoing about the classification of where ethnography stand as a science, especially when it comes to the application of postmodern theory, I believe creating subjective ethnographies has a place in anthropological study. Personal experience drives understanding, as Rosaldo argues, and looking back on my own, I would definitely have to agree. Our culture informs our beliefs and opinions, and being immersed in the experiences of another culture can add to those views. Rosaldo's writings resonated with me, especially after assessing my early times in Nepal. Interpretation changes with position, and I hope to carry the concepts of experience, understanding, ethic description, and a lot more into my future research and ethnographies in order to maximize my own insight into other cultures as well as my own. And I'd just like to leave you with this quote by Rosaldo. "Anthropology invites us to expand our sense of human possibilities through the study of other forms of life. Not unlike learning another language, such inquiry requires time and patience. There are no shortcuts. We cannot, for example, simply use our imaginations to invent other cultural worlds."